issue basically is that Barrick Gold, which is a Canadian mining company, is the world's largest gold miner, and they're facing opposition there from a number of local and international stakeholders. Basically, this is causing schedule delays, budget blowouts, and we've been brought in, we're consultants, we've been brought in to present to you guys, the board, our analysis of what the issues are and how we think we might best deal with those going forward. So just to give you some idea about what the project is about and what the issues are. So as I said, it's located in the Andes Mountains. It's actually at an altitude of 4,500 metres. So it's right up pretty high. It's in a fairly fragile ecosystem, which includes glaciers. It straddles the border of Chile and Argentina. And actually in 2006 was granted bilateral approval from both of those governments to proceed. Actually what's happened in the last month is the approval from the Chilean side has been suspended. The court has ruled that it was unconstitutional and work has stopped on that side. So a fairly timely annual general meeting was held last month. And we'd like to present to you what we think the issues are there and what can be done about it. So we'll chat through the ethical issues, the business performance issues and legal issues surrounding this, and then give you our recommendations and actions to take forward. So I'll start with a quote here from Peter Monk, who is the Barrick founder and CEO. He said, this is just last month at the board meeting, did we know then that the same governments who practically begged us to invest in the remote areas were going to be changed, and the newcomers would say, who are these foreigners? Why would they come and take our gold away from us? We see this as fairly representative of the issues at Barrick. They feel like they've done the right thing by the government and probably by the local people. But they haven't really invested enough into those same local people, and therein lies the problem. That's why there's issues both on the ground and a bit further afield as well. So we see three main sets of issues: ethical concerns, financial considerations, and legal issues. In terms of ethical concerns, we see the main issue actually being the difference between a legal approval granted by the government versus a social licence to operate. There are some environmental issues and it's unclear whether these are being addressed sufficiently, and there are some human rights concerns as well. In terms of financial, as I already mentioned, the budget overruns are fairly large, and there's been a number of delays. Goodness knows when they'll be able to start mining on the Chilean side again, if at all. And legal issues as well there. There are issues both in Chile and Argentina surrounding the legitimacy of the laws that enable that approval to be granted, but there are some issues in international courts as well. So I'm going to pass it over to Kit, who will go through the ethical concerns in some more detail.
Thanks for that, Bronwyn. So I'm going to talk about the ethical issues that we think that Barrick has to face up to in the Pascua-Lama case. But before we delve too deeply into that, I'd like to start with a quote from the elected representative of the people of Pascua-Lama, who are indigenous people to Chile and Argentina. So we'd like to bear in mind here that these are people who make up just between 2 and 4% of the populations of Argentina and Chile, because most of these populations today are the descendants of European settlers. So this is an extremely fragile community that we're talking about here, and one that has managed to, against the odds, maintain its lifestyle and way of life over hundreds of years. But this is what he has to say today about the mining project. It says, the people have left their farms and no longer work. Many have considered selling their land to move. They don't think there is anything left to do in the valley. And they will no longer be able to export fruit if the water becomes contaminated with heavy metals. In addition, those of us that remain here, who are human beings, we are made to feel as if we are intruding. So these, we think, are some of the ethical issues that Barrick has to face up to in Pascua-Lama. And because they did not face up to them, that is the reason that we're seeing many of the legal and financial problems in their business today. We think there are three distinct issues, which Bronwyn covered earlier, which was firstly, they lack a social license to operate, as opposed to merely legal license. Secondly, that local stakeholders feel excluded from the entire mine development process. And finally, that their environmental concerns that have been raised about the project have not been adequately addressed by Barrick. So on the first point, of a social license to operate. While there is no objective definition of what a social license to operate is, it is usually broadly defined as when a company has the ongoing approval and support of the local community and local stakeholders where they're conducting the project. And according to this definition, we would say that Barrick definitively does not have a social license to operate, because we've seen that there has been continued local community opposition and demonstrations have been organised against the Pascua-Lama project. And other key stakeholders, such as Greenpeace and other NGOs, continue to complain about the behaviour of Barrick in Pascua-Lama. In addition, we would say that even though Barrick would argue that they had the legal license to operate, and that therefore they'd addressed their responsibilities to the people of Chile and Argentina, we would say that in this case there is a lack of alignment between the regulatory approval on one hand and the social license to operate on the other. Because what we see is that the source of each of these types of approval is different. In one case, for the legal approval, it is the central government, but in the other case, it is the local community. And in cases such as Pascua-Lama, where the indigenous people often do not recognize the legitimacy of a central government which is made up of descendants that they do not recognize, they do not recognize the legitimacy of these governments to make decisions on their behalf. And therefore, we would say that a social license to operate here is even more crucial than in normal circumstances, because otherwise what we're doing is we're denying these people a voice in how their own community is run, and we are instead giving power to another group that they do not recognize as having any power over their territory or their way of life. On the second point of local stakeholders being excluded, we feel that there are two main points here. Firstly, the indigenous community of Pascua-Lama say that they have been excluded from the development process, and we see this in several fronts. First of all, they have no formal voice or representation in any of the panels or boards that have been constituted to make decisions about the Pascua-Lama project and to give the green light to this project. Secondly, even though Barrick has indeed spent millions of dollars in consultation and millions of dollars in publicly informing the people of Pascua-Lama about their intentions with regard to this project, they still do not feel that they've been adequately represented. Because we have to remember that this is a project that's going to change the entire way that they live. Given the magnitude of this project, we don't think that Barrick has done enough to inform and include the people of Pascua-Lama in this decision. And finally, we see that while the mine development process does pose significant risks to the people of Pascua-Lama, specifically in terms of potential environmental contamination, there's been no corresponding benefit sharing offered from Barrick to the people of Pascua-Lama. So all they're doing is asking them to take all the risk while excluding them from the rewards, which is why the local stakeholders feel excluded. Therefore, human rights NGOs would argue that this is a violation of the rights of the people of Pascua-Lama, which is a point that Dan will expand on later on in the legal issues. Finally, we see that there is the allegations of an adverse environmental impact that Barrick has failed to adequately address. The local community itself is especially worried about possible water contamination. We heard from the elected president earlier, who told you about how farmers were leaving already because they feel that the water is being contaminated and that they will not be able to continue with their lifestyle. We're talking about the destruction of their entire way of life because they will not be able to continue with agricultural activity if and when there is pollution as a result of mining into their rivers. Secondly, environmental NGOs say that, in fact, this pollution has already started and this damage has already started. And we're talking here about Pascua-Lama, which is a region which is an extremely fragile ecosystem. They are made up of glaciers and fragile vegetation, which are unique to that part of the world. And the damage done here by any action of pollution cannot be reversed in just one generation. And what we've seen here is that the glaciers have already shrunk by 50 to 70% from the start of mining development activity. And NGOs such as Greenpeace allege that the rivers and streams are also already being contaminated. And yet Barrick has not done enough to deal with either of these concerns. And so we urge you to consider these ethical concerns, not just from their face value, not just from the plight of these marginalized people, but also from the fact later on that as Dan and Wei will point out, that there are real legal and financial repercussions as a result of ignoring these ethical issues. So I'll now pass you on to Dan, who's going to talk about the legal issues.
Thank you, Ken. I think some of the problems surrounding legal issues are nicely framed by this quote from Romina Goliti. She was appointed in 2006 to a position with the Environment Ministry in Argentina, and around that time the government in Argentina was looking at this issue already. She's an outspoken critic in some respects of this project. In 2008, she was removed from that position as a result of her outspoken criticism of it. To a degree, I think this demonstrates that merely giving lip service, bringing somebody inside who will criticize but not following through with the force of those criticisms is no solution. As we'll see in the next slide, some of her criticisms have in fact come to fruition and the project has halted because of some of the very reasons that she's given. So what she says is Ibecc is a modern example of how powerful economic giants can manipulate local politics, skirt environmental regulations in order to maximize profit, minimize investment risk, and ignore local culture and communities to the detriment of the greater global good. If we look at the legal issues primarily through four buckets, at the national level in Argentina, Chile, and Canada, as well as the international level, we'll see that there are both issues that have emerged through the courts, but also issues related more to legislation and the political process, which ultimately do impact the legality of the project. In Argentina, the reason why the former minister was removed is actually her support of the National Glacier Protection Act. This piece of legislation was initially passed by both houses of Congress in Argentina in 2008. However, Ibecc allegedly lobbied the Argentine president, Ms. Kirchner, heavily and caused her to veto this piece of legislation. Ultimately, the piece of legislation passed in 2010 despite her veto. Ibecc then went on to challenge the legislation's constitutionality in the courts and to deny that it would even apply to Ibecc because Ibecc claims is not operating on glaciers that would be covered under the Act. Currently, it's unclear whether the legislation is in fact constitutional and whether Ibecc will be affected by it. That issue is before the courts in Argentina. In Chile, similar issues regarding environmental irregularities have emerged. The outcome of that is last month, a Chilean Court of Appeal suspended further construction on over 50% of the mine due to its impact primarily on glaciers. Internationally, we see many of these issues percolating up above the national level. Forums such as the Inter-American Commission are looking at it, as well as the International Labour Organization, to which both Argentina and Chile are members and have signed on to Convention number 169, which effectively guarantees First Nations Aboriginal rights with respect to free, prior, and informed consent over activities that will impact their lands. They argue that that consent has not been given for this project, and those matters are currently in these forums. And in Canada, although there's no necessary legal approvals in the same regulatory sense, we see that Ibecc's actions have even caused them problems there. They had been lobbying the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, Nigel Wright, allegedly trying to persuade the Canadian government to give them a more favorable hearing. Apparently, Nigel Wright did adequately disclose that lobbying effort, and the matter is currently before the Canadian Ethics Commissioner. Also of note is the perceived closeness between Mr. Wright and Peter Monk, Mr. Wright being the godfather of Peter Monk's grandchild. So whether or not any of this is materially important, it does create certain perceptual issues. I'll turn it over to my colleague Wade, who's going to talk about some of the financial consequences.
Thank you, Dan. So the controversy of the Pascua-Lama project has created huge uncertainties around Ibecc's business performance and has made this project more expensive than their initial estimation. Here we have this quote from John, CEO of Mason Placements, a gold analyst firm. It's up in the Andes and the price tag kept going up. If they ever complete it, it will be the world's most expensive gold mine. So for the business performance, there were three major issues. First is the overrun budget, then the delayed schedule, and generally has a negative impact on Ibecc's share price. So first, let's start with the budget. In March 2011, Ibecc has estimated that the total investment in this project will be $3.3 billion. But in their latest annual report of year 2012, this number has ballooned up to $8.5 billion, increasing by more than 150%. And then the schedule. In 2011, the production from Pascua-Lama was expected to start in the mid-2013. But in the latest report, this schedule was pushed back to late 2014. And the recent suspension from the Chile side has made this new schedule of 2014 even more doubtful. So The schedule delay has brought more risks to Barrick's business because recently the commodity market has been very volatile. The gold price has dropped by 20% in the last 4 months. So it will be very hard for Barrick to estimate the project return if they cannot fix the schedule problem. And generally speaking, we think the market has lost confidence in Barrick's decision on this project. So the company's share price has fallen by 30% in the last 2 years. And since falling by the suspension on the Chile side, there was an additional 8% drop in share price. Another evidence is the rating of the company. Standard & Poor's has recently just downgraded Barrick from A- to BBB+, in which it cited execution risks surrounding Pascua-Lama as a primary cause for the downgrade. So up to now, Barrick has already invested $4.8 billion in this project. And if they want to suspend this project, this number has to be written off. And this number is 1/3 of Barrick's annual revenue in last year. So it's a huge number. But it's also very expensive on the opportunity side, because Pascua-Lama is one of the largest reserves for Barrick. And if they suspend this project, it will have a huge impact on their portfolio. And it will essentially compromise their competency in the future decade. So it is obvious that Barrick cannot afford abandoning this project because it's too expensive. Therefore, we have to work out on the solutions to proceed the project. Now I would like to hand over to Bronwyn to talk you through our recommendations to the company.
So as you can see, balancing the ethical, legal and business imperatives of this project is a tough ask. However, this is not the first or only resource project to have been attempted to be undertaken in a difficult global condition. So what we did was we made a benchmarking exercise with other companies facing similar issues. We found leaders in the industry, such as Anglo-American, BHP Billiton and Rio Tinto, who have actually published on this topic. Between them, they've come up with things such as the social responsibility for mining and development in developing countries, and the social license toolkit, both of which are great resources for other mining companies. But we believe that Barrick could easily be amongst these industry leaders. We also, so we looked at what they're doing in their projects. We also looked at the IFC Equator Principles, which were developed specifically for projects like this, in order to develop those projects in a sustainable and ethical manner. So the 3 principles that we believe that Barrick should consider when they're working out their future actions and making future decisions at Pascua-Lama and other projects in their portfolio. We believe those 3 principles are transparency, participation, and alignment of incentives. So basically, for transparency, we believe that Barrick need to engage more fully with all concerned parties. They need to engage earlier, so before issues even occur, and keep everybody informed and up to date and feeling like they have a real voice. They need to make it clear and public the environmental studies that they're doing and mitigation programs that they have in place, so that, assuming that they are doing the right thing, everyone believes the studies that they're doing and can take those at face value. We also want to make public who is being compensated, how and why. There are situations where compensation will be appropriate, but this all needs to be kept above board so that the issues surrounding perhaps under the table payments or inappropriate lobbying don't affect the company. The last thing we will urge you guys to do as the board is to really look at that discount rate and make sure it really includes the risks associated with this project so that it's being priced correctly. So one of the suggestions we have around participation is that we'd like to see the establishment of a steering committee that actually involves the people, the local people, but other stakeholders. We'd like this steering committee to have a real and impactful voice, and particularly over decisions that concern the local community, so that they can have a real input and impact, and so that the project can occur in a way that is third suggestion that we have is to work out some sort of alignment of incentives, some sort of revenue sharing agreement. At the moment, as Kit talked about before, the people of Pascualama sort of bear all the downside risk and Barrick is looking at most of the upside risk. If we can make it so that if this project is a raging success, then the communities also stand to benefit, and vice versa. If there's issues with the project, the community has assurances that Barrick will be there to pick up the pieces, and so that they have a real interest in making sure that it works and works sustainably and in a way that the community is happy with. We think that would go a long way to helping this situation. So Dan, Kit and Wei will now detail how these recommendations actually impact the specific issues that they spoke about earlier.
So on the ethical side of things, earlier I identified that there were three main ethical issues that Barrick should address. Firstly, lack of an SLO, secondly, stakeholder exclusion, and thirdly, environmental impact. And what we see is the three recommendations that we've made here definitively address each of these concerns, and at the very least will give Barrick a reason to say that yes, we have addressed these ethical concerns, and yes, we can stand up with a clear conscience to the people of Pascualama. So in the case of the first one about the lack of a social license to operate, we think that on our transparency initiative, what we're going to be doing is going to be giving greater legitimacy to the entire mine development process. Because by making the criteria more transparent, by making it clear to the people that we're engaging with them early on and in a deep and meaningful way, we're going to be generating more ongoing support from the people of Pascualama. On the second point of allowing them to participate and give them real decision-making power, we think this self-evidently is going to generate a better social license to operate as well. Because now the people will feel that they have a real stake in this operation, and that they feel that, will feel that Barrick is addressing their concerns. On the final point of incentives, we think that by ensuring that both the upside and the downside, the interests of both parties, so Barrick and the people of Pascualama, are aligned, we're going to be generating more of a social license to operate, because the people will see that there is a benefit for them and see why Pascualama is there, see why Barrick is there to begin with. On the second point of stakeholder exclusion, we think, once again, all our 3 points are doing exactly the opposite, exactly what is needed. We are including them in the decision-making process by giving them some participatory power. We're including them in the process from the beginning because we're making transparent the criteria used when we evaluate our projects and making transparent how we're going to treat the local communities. And we're including them in the benefits by ensuring that any upside will be seen by the people of Pascualama as well. And on the final point, on environmental impact, we think that there are two main, we're going to address this in two main ways. First of all, by creating more transparency about the criteria that we're using, we're going to help assuage the concerns of the people of Pascualama, as well as NGOs like Greenpeace, by showing them the criteria and the people that we're using to evaluate the environmental impact. This will allow groups like Greenpeace to be able to be more constructive in the way in which they engage with people, like engage with Barrick, because they're going to be able to see the criteria that's being used and be able to criticize them on specific points, rather than simply having to look at the black box and not understand how and why they're choosing to make certain actions with regards to which affect the environment. On the points of incentives, we think with what is going to happen here when we align the incentives of both the people of Pascualama and tie them to the environmental impact, that's going to create more trust between the people of Pascualama and the Barrick Corporation. Because when there is going to be an environmental impact, they know that they're going to be taken care of, there's going to be some compensation, and they also know that Barrick has a reason to ensure that environmental impact doesn't occur, because they know that it will hurt their bottom line. And so I'll pass you on to Dan now, who is going to talk about the legal issues.
Rather than walk through legal issues, I'd like you to think of the formal legalities of each of these cases, which will vary and which will be dealt to varying degrees by the recommendations we have. But more importantly, the underlying principles that underlie those formal legalities and the way that those principles will be satisfied. Because while we could suggest how each formal legality will be met, more importantly, both in terms of doing the right thing, but also from a legal risk management perspective, is meeting those principles, because it will satisfy these legal issues that exist today, as well as potentially minimize the risk that other legal issues will emerge in the future. So at the level of principles, we believe that transparency will help across the board. It will show how the science is being generated. It will show how the negotiations are occurring. It'll show what we're doing, and it'll allow free prior informed consent to emerge. Without transparency, it will be impossible for fully informed consent to be given on behalf of the Aboriginal people. Similarly, participation in the process upon a very transparent basis, both from environmental stakeholders as well as Aboriginal stakeholders, is a prerequisite to meeting some of the principles that animate the various legal standards that we're dealing with. Particularly here, the International Labour Organization has a set of legal standards that have been adopted by Chile and Argentina guaranteeing Aboriginal rights. And participation is one of the fundamental concerns in those standards, ILO 169, that require participation and consent on behalf of the people. And finally, we see incentives as a likely outcome of maintaining these first two principles. In terms of equal distribution of benefits, it would be difficult to envisage how, with transparency and increased participation, there wouldn't be some degree of redistribution of incentives. So again, rather than speaking to how each one of these legal issues would be resolved, I think at the principle level it would help. And also, I would suggest that each one of these legal issues could, to some degree, be resolved by the thorough adoption of these three principles. I'll turn it over to Wei, who can speak to some of the financial consequences.
So on the business side, we have to acknowledge that the existing overall budget and the schedule delay can hardly be solved. So our suggestions will tackle on the issue by avoiding further expansions in both budget and schedule. So by involving different stakeholders, and especially local community, and sharing benefits with them, we can better control the project and decrease the uncertainties. And more specifically, by increasing the transparencies, both Barrick and the stakeholders can understand whether their sustainability costs and environmental costs are included in our current budget, and how much is that. And also, I think our suggestion will have an overall impact on the share price, with better control on the project, and I think the market confidence for Barrick's future performance can be restored. So it is clear from this case that doing business like this is not only about financial returns or making agreements with governments. Lacking of effective involvement with local communities and different stakeholders will compromise our business performance. So we have to rethink the legitimacy of our business, especially from the social perspective. We would like to use this excellent quote from Mr. Pierre Lassonde, the president of Newmont Mining Corporation, which is also one of the leading Canadian mining companies in the world. And this could also be a very good response to Mr. Peter Mo, who is also in this picture with Ms. Lassonde. You don't get a social license by going to government ministry and making an application or simply paying a fee. It requires you to do more than money to truly become part of the community in which you operate. So this is our presentation. We'd like to take your questions now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I can see that our money spent on your consulting firm has been well spent. Knowing my colleagues on the board as I do, I'm pretty sure we have some questions for you.
Sure. Thank you for your presentation. It was excellent. We keep coming back with this idea that we need to engage the local population. Do you have any specific suggestions, or have you looked at specifically how you would go about that?
So I think one of the
how would it work is what I'm trying to figure out.
Yeah. So there are mines elsewhere in the world where very fragile environmental conditions exist, where what they've done is they've taken leaders from the Indigenous community and created a steering committee, and that's what we'd like to do here. So people who are either elected by their own people or who have some specific knowledge in the area, what we suggest is that they form a committee, they meet on a regular basis, and they both discuss and test things that are important to them. An example, in this mine that I'm thinking of, they operate in Arctic Canada, and they have fishermen that go and fish once a month. They sort of test how long it takes for them to catch a fish. They cook that fish and they eat it, and they decide whether that the water quality is still what they expect. Something similar, we hope, could be employed here. So local fishermen, local farmers, things that are important to them, like water quality, like the ability to maintain the crops. We hope that they could have some sort of testing regime that satisfies them, that all the environmental criteria are being met. But also when there are decisions to be made, perhaps even when the line is expanded or if extra things need to happen, that they have an opportunity to voice their concerns, perhaps, and give suggestions about the best way of doing that. I mean, we think that possibly the issue here is just that they don't understand, or not everyone understands the process, what's going on. If they had the opportunity to ask questions, see what steps are being taken, and really feel like they're having their voice heard, I think that would go a long way to actually engaging the community and getting everyone on the same page.
During your benchmarking, I'm kind of stuck on the compensation or incentive to the local people. To me, it kind of feels like we're paying the local people to get a social license to work there in a way. And your benchmarking, was that one of the things that they said was to give incentives to the local people that tie the kind of the profit of the mine to the local people?
Yeah, so royalties is one way of doing it. If these people have a legitimate claim to land, which they do, they get a percentage of the profits, and so they can share in the success of the project. And I think specifically what we're talking about is yes, having the community share in the wealth of the project, but also having Barrick share in any pain that is going to be felt by the community. So if there are issues, they need to be there to pick up the pieces, but also pay for any restitution, pay for the damage that they do, and so that what we want is to see both the upside and the downside shared by both parties.
Is there, in dealing with the local people, is there a person that we can deal with or leadership within that? It feels like we're just, 2 to 3%. Like, do we know what the community of the local people look like? And is there a way to kind of get that kind of contract? Because saying that we're going to pick up environmental issues from now until the end of time to anyone who wants to come makes me a little...
Yeah, so we heard earlier from Sergio Campesino. So he's the elected president of the indigenous people of Pasqualama. So he would be the type of person who has the legitimacy to negotiate on their behalf, and with whom any type of legal arrangement could be made. So yeah, obviously it would be limited to the people in that area. It would be limited to people directly affected by the possible water contamination. But yes, there is an existing structure that we can tap into there, and that's what we'd like to do.
But also, just to your point, Scott, I think you touch on a really important concern, which is political structures in these communities may not be as tight or what we're used to dealing with. And so simply going to the head of that particular political structure may not be adequate because you don't know what the dissenting voices in that community sound like and what rights they have to go around their elected or hereditary head. There is no easy solution to that, obviously. I think the best we would propose is probably the more robust you can make your solution, the less likely it is to have to deal with those dissenting voices in the future. But we certainly wouldn't sit here and say you can eliminate all risk and do right by everybody. And that's certainly more risky in situations like these than dealing with other types of government that businesses may be more accustomed to.
2 questions for the 4 of you. First of all, what other environmental examples or other issues have you benchmarked against? Let's try to start with that one. Do you have any specific examples of countries or issues? Or was this studied in isolation?
So the 2 studies that we looked at, one which was by Anglo-American, which is their social responsibility toolkit, that talks quite broadly about the things that you should do when you're going into a new community. And then they're not talking about national governments, they're talking about when you go somewhere and you're actually having an impact on a community that doesn't have perhaps direct veto rights over your project. So the sort of things that they talk about are the point at which you need to engage people, the level of information that you need to give them, the frequency of engagement, but also things like the environmental baseline studies that you need to do, and sort of making all that information freely available for people, so that when you start your operation, then you have something, basically a baseline to reference it to. And I guess the idea is not so much to have a contract with the local community, but just to basically, it's a way of fitting into that local community, being a responsible member of it. So, being contributing to local community, things like schools, health programs and things like that, which are actually beneficial to the community rather than hopefully being seen as facilitation payments or anything like that.
Okay. I'm just curious about other examples. And then if you go to the preceding slide, that one there, do you have a plan for becoming part of the community, or is this addressed somehow, or?
Sorry. To become part of.
This statement seems to recommend that you become part of the community in which you operate. Is this part of your recommendations? Do you have any details on that?
I mean, I think, so just back to our ethical point, I think here, what we were saying was basically the problems precisely that Barrack wasn't seen as part of the community, which is why it lacked a social license to operate, because stakeholders felt excluded and they felt their environmental concerns weren't being addressed. We hope that through our initiatives here, the transparency, participation incentives, we are going to become part of their community. They're going to feel that they own the process and they're involved in it.
So, and just to your previous question about other industries, we didn't look specifically to benchmark against other industries. I do know that, however, in other natural resource-based industries, these types of concerns, I mean, whether it's forestry or fishing or what have you, emerge again and again, particularly where there's a large interface with Aboriginal communities, and the types of problems and types of solutions are broadly reflected. So we didn't look at best practice toolkit across industries, but what we're suggesting is in line broadly with what industry.
Wayne, I have a question for your team. Look, the price of gold is down, but it fluctuates. And because the price of gold is down, of course the share price is down, it'll come back. Why don't we just go in, extract all the gold we can get, and then get out of Pascua-Lama?
So for us, we think the problem is not the price, but it's the volatility and the uncertainty in this project. Now it's kind of like out of control from Barrack's side. They do not know when there will be another problem and who will oppose the project, and there may be future suspensions for the project. So what we suggest is to control what we can control, to involve the stakeholders in decision making and to let them know more information so that we can have better control over the overall project. We can hardly control the gold price. The gold price is for every gold mining company. But what we can do is try to do best in our process and try to make it less volatile for the project, but both the budget and the schedule. So this is what we suggest.
I'll fuck your judge. You mentioned about compensation. And you mentioned that you looked at other studies, not comparing, finding a benchmark to another gold mining, but you did notice that fish and wildlife do come up, as you just mentioned. And you mentioned compensation as a group. Reasonable compensation. To what point? Because if we're going to do this mining and we're going to go after this gold, and my colleague has just made this point, we know this, gold is going to come back. I'm assuming you guys jumped on an airplane. Gold is used. I mean, so my question would be is, if the environmental impact, which comes out and we're showing transparency and it doesn't show fatalities or death, because of the erosion to the environment, to the contamination of the water, are we still satisfied with providing the minimum compensation, even if it brings fatalities?
Absolutely not.
Well, we if we go into this, if we're going into an agreement and we say we're going to be here for 30, 40 years, and then we move out, and the impact to the people is going to be felt 50, 60, 70 years later.
Go ahead. So we're both eager to answer.
Because I know once you cure death, I know everyone doesn't want to touch it, but
So the answer I would give, maybe Brian can answer after, or slightly different, is that to a degree, compensation is going to be an outcome of a process, and what we want to guarantee is that process is structured in the right way so you get the fairest and most durable possible outcome. So rather than focusing on, okay, what is that dollar value, and can we balance that dollar value out against death, that's not how we would see that process being structured, either procedurally or conceptually. Both procedurally and conceptually, we'd say, okay, well, is this a transparent process? Is there meaningful participation in this process? Once you start to guarantee things like that, then you're sitting down at the table with a group that can make an informed consent, and you have to some degree, accept that by them doing so, they will reach an outcome that's acceptable to them, fully knowing the risk that, even 50 years down the road, something unforeseen may happen. But if they are as informed and knowledgeable as possible, then you have to trust that they can make that and accept that set of risks. And that's how you derive that number.
Just quickly, I would just add to that we see compensation as just one part, one recommendation of a suite. So we expect Barrick to continue with their environmental assessments and their mitigation plans. We certainly don't see paying off the community as a substitute for that. Being good environmental citizens is just as important as making sure that the people who currently live there are sufficiently compensated for their land and for any loss that they incur. So, as well as a transparent compensation scheme and a whole bunch of other things, we would expect Barrick to, if not maintain, then improve their environmental monitoring program and carry out this operation in the most practicable way that minimises any opportunity for environmental damage.
If we decide to do what you're suggesting, how likely is it that you think that this is going to work, that it's going to get this project back on track? And I know it's a real hard question because, of course, it depends on what you're suggesting, number one. But that's exactly what we have to decide. We have to decide if taking on putting in the resources, the cost of doing what you're suggesting is going to work. We got to figure that out. Do you have any idea in terms of probability, chances as to whether this would work?
Well, I think one thing that the last month made clear with the court ruling was there's a 100% probability we will not be able to continue if we don't change the way that we're paying right now, because work has been stopped on the Chilean side of the mine. Given those odds and given the fact that $4.8 billion has already been invested in this project, and what we're talking about here is maybe in the tens of millions at best, at most, per year. It would have to be an incredibly small percentage chance for us not to want to go ahead with this project, I would say.
Yeah, I'm not as worried about the money because I think cash-wise we're fine with this. It's much more of the details. The thing that catches my eye is the transparency. I agree that for the local people we need to be more transparent. My concern is all the third parties like Greenpeace and other organizations that really don't have a take in this. Being more transparent, they're going to fight us either way. Either our current black box approach or being transparent. Being transparent, doesn't that just give them more firepower? I mean, are they really going to be like, oh, thanks for being transparent, we're good with you now? Aren't they going to be able to dig in a little bit more?
I'll start that one. Pick up my message, yeah. I think when dealing with the third parties, particularly ones which seem, I guess, more structurally averse to us, I would look at it in two lenses. One is, how how much do they actually want to accomplish the benefit that they're saying they want to accomplish. And then the other is kind of what are the realities on the ground for them in terms of their own fundraising needs, their own political needs, and the rest of it. To the degree that you can be transparent and then hand in hand with that, allow them to participate in the process and actually create positive outcomes that align with their stated goals, I think they would be really receptive to that transparency and participation. Because through those things, you can take it out of a very unnecessarily adversarial position and actually be a little more cooperative. The concern, though, is for that second, how can you position it for them so that winning with Barrick also means winning for Greenpeace with its own constituents, right? And that's a lot more tough. If Greenpeace sees its position as needing to be in a fight with Goliath, it may be very hard, right? But if you can work with them in such a way as to show, they were the guys that actually, in this case, David was victorious, and that's why Barrick is doing what it's doing in this project, then I think transparency and the participation that comes along with it is a feasible solution for parties like Greenpeace.
So following on with Scott's question, if we're dealing with so many third parties, who's leading that effort? Is there a person, an office, a group? Who handles that?
Yeah, so we would expect that Barrick would have a community or stakeholder engagement group which deals specifically with both local communities and other people who think that they have some sort of stake, legitimately or otherwise. I mean, it's a bit hard to say whether international NGOs really have a right to say what happens on this project if everybody else is happy. But they are a loud voice and therefore an important one. So we would expect, yes, that there would be a group of people whose job it is to manage that.
Kit, I have one, this will have to be a final question. Question for you. With all due respect, we've hired a team of scientists from Harvard, and they tell us that the receding glaciers have absolutely nothing to do with our mining operations. What's your thought on that?
Well, if that was true, it's certainly not a message that's gotten out to anyone involved in this project at Pascal level, which only plays into our point of transparency even further.
These people don't know about global warming?
Or it's more that these people don't know why things are happening, and no one's bothered to explain it to them. And if no one bothers to explain to the people of Pascualama what's happening in the environment and why, the natural reaction of anyone is to blame the foreign entity that has just emerged, has disappeared in their ecosystem. So we think that transparency is definitely something that would be a benefit to Barrick in that regard.
Good. Take a deep breath.
Yeah.
Feedback from the team? We're out of character now.
Yeah.